So thank you very much, everyone, for joining us. It's much appreciated. I'm Chris. I'm an executive committee member for Team Global. If you haven't joined us before, then thank you very much for joining us. So what we'll do, and the way that these sessions are organised, is that we'll have a briefing from Chris Doyle. Thank you very much to Chris for joining us this evening. It's much appreciated. And then once we've gone through the introductions and Chris's briefing, we'll run into a Q&A session. If you do have any Q&As or questions throughout the briefing, please do feel free to put them in the chat function and I can pass them on to Chris. Equally, if you do have any questions, please feel free to raise your hand, or when you're asking the question, please indicate that you'd be happy to come onto the mic and I'll invite you on. But without further ado, we'll get started. So thank you very much, everyone, for joining. So basic background into Team Global and what we do. So Team Global was founded in 1958 as the European Atlantic Movement, which is an independent apolitical educational foundation. So Team aims to enable young people to act as global citizens and to aspire to leadership roles within their communities. We empower them to consider world issues and to take their part in resolving problems and promoting solutions. So we work alongside students through our student-led initiative, The International Perspective, in which a team of students help their peers and wider society to become more aware of international issues. Through webinars such as this, we are engaging with students across the UK to think globally on a range of issues from cybersecurity, global inequality, and in the case of this webinar, Britain's future relationship with the Middle East. So a quick background into Chris and the organisation that he works for. So the Council for Arab-British Understanding. So the Council is a non-for-profit cross-party organisation whose mission is to work for a British Middle East policy that promotes conflict resolution, human rights, and civil society in the Arab world through informed debate and mutual understanding. It is one of the most active NGOs working on the Middle East in Britain, in the British Parliament since its establishment in 1967. From then on, the Council has assumed an active advocacy, educational, and media role. So a quick introduction to Chris, and then the floor is yours. So Chris is the director at the council and its lead spokesperson. As an acknowledged expert on the area, Chris is a frequent commentator on TV and radio. He gives numerous talks around the country on numerous issues, including the Arab Spring, Libya, Syria, Palestine, Iraq, Islamophobia, and the Arabs in Britain. He regularly has articles published in the British and international media. He's been working at the council since 1993 after graduating with a first-class honours degree in Arabic and Islamic studies at Exeter University. Since then, he has travelled widely in the Middle East and North Africa. In 1996, Chris moved to work for a professional government relations firm, but promptly returned to a more senior role at the council in 1997. In November 2002, he was made a full-time director. He has spoken at numerous international conferences in the past. He has given talks at Chatham House, RUSI, the Dubai Press Club, and the annual Doha Forum on Free Trade and Democratization in Qatar. On 29th of November 2005, Chris addressed the United Nations on an occasion on the International Day of Solidarity with the Palestinians. His statement was delivered on behalf of the International Coordinating Network on Palestine. He has urged members on the UN General Assembly to increase their efforts to establish a meaningful peace process with which the aim of creating a viable Palestinian state on the territory occupied in 1967. Finally, Chris writes for a number of journals about the region and the UK correspondent for the Middle East International, covering all aspects of the British relationship with the Middle East. He's a visiting lecturer at St Mary's College, University of Surrey, lecturing on religion in the Middle East. He was also a chair of Friends of, apologies for my pronunciation of this, Brits, something like that. Apologies, Chris, I'm sure you'll correct me, University, and a former trustee of medical aid for Palestinians. He's also a member of the Royal Institute for International Affairs. And without further ado, Chris, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Chris, and thanks very much to Team Anthony Frost, who it's a great pleasure to see after so many years. And in the past, we had the great pleasure at Caabu of welcoming you to our offices. And it's a great pity that this has to be virtual, but I hope that we can survive that. And I do want, if you do have questions or if something's not clear in what I've said, please do raise your hand or put something in the chat. Let's try to make this as interactive as is possible. So you've got a little bit of an intro to what we do. We do a lot of work with British politicians. We, pandemic aside, arrange delegations out to the region to try to, show British politicians what is going on, give them an introduction to issues that largely otherwise they do not know much about. And in fairness, we live in a world where nobody is going to be elected into the British Parliament for their knowledge and expertise on the Middle East. Of course, it's going to be domestic issues that, or what most voters are interested in. And foreign affairs has gone down the agenda over the years. I think if you go back to the 1980s, I used to work for an MP who would say that it has really changed in those days. The Cold War, foreign affairs and defense were major issues. And I think that being foreign secretary and defense secretary was more important in those days than perhaps it is now. And all too frequently, we find prime ministers who want to put their potential rival within a party into either the Foreign Office or into the Defense Ministry. So I think of Michael Portillo under John Major, Gordon Brown putting David Miliband into the Foreign Office when he was Prime Minister, and of course, perhaps most tellingly, the way in which Theresa May made Boris Johnson Foreign Secretary. So we do a lot of work with MPs on a variety of issues. In recent years, because of the number of challenges, crises, and wars in the Middle East, we focused on conflict issues and the consequences of conflicts, including humanitarian issues, refugees, but also the potential spread of extremism. So that's sort of, enough by way of background. It's a very broad topic to deal with today. So hopefully I will, be able to, deal with plenty of some of these issues, but, I'm sure there'll be some burning stuff that you will wish to ask about. I'll start off by saying straight off, at the moment, the British government does not have a Foreign Office minister for the Middle East, and it doesn't have a policy on the Middle East. There is no definable strategy. In terms of ministers, we have the extraordinary thing since February, for the first time that I can recall, and many British ambassadors and former ministers that I've spoken to, where we do not have a specific Foreign Office minister who is tasked with, responsible for the Middle East and North Africa. What we have now, for the first time, is a division. Amanda Milling, newly promoted into this role, is now the Minister for East Asia and the Middle East. Lord Ahmed in the Lords, Tariq Ahmed, deals with North Africa. And in many ways, that gives you an indication of the lack of importance that this government attaches to the Middle East right now. Because, of course, imagine, for example, that you are Egypt, you are an active and very important player in the situation in Israel-Palestine, particularly, for example, in Gaza. You're primarily dealing with Lord Ahmed, who's the Minister for Africa, yet the whole issue of Israel-Palestine is dealt with by a completely different minister. So this just gives you an idea. I don't believe this situation will survive because it made complete sense that you deal with that area that has a certain degree of commonalities, linguistically, predominant language being Arabic, political issues as well. It makes sense that this all goes together. I should add also that the previous minister who was dealing with the Middle East and North Africa, James Cleverly, still handles the issue of Iran. So this is a really strange situation. I think that many governments that are dealing with the Foreign Office at the moment are struggling on that front. But I also said there is no Middle East policy. Now, this is not something that is necessarily unique to this government. And I really want to make this really clear, because I think, particularly when you speak to interlocutors, partners, people from the region, they imagine that there is some well-developed Middle East policy approach, strategy in terms of how to deal with this region. The reality is, before the British government comes to determine a series of policies that affect its relations with the Middle East, it goes through all sorts of differing filters that take priority. What do I mean by that? First of all, Britain's relationship with key partners, the United States, the European Union, at least until recently, arguably, would be of paramount importance. How we as a government deal with the United States really has an influence on how then later on the government's approach will be towards the Middle East. Let me give you some examples. Tony Blair, for example, when George W. Bush became president in 2000, adapted his approach to the Middle East very much to both this new president with his coterie of neocons, Republicans like Paul Wolfowitz and John Bolton, to being an approach that, would be more appreciated in Washington. He felt it was very important to do that. Previous to that, he had been extremely close to Bill Clinton, not least because he took on board the lesson that John Major had struggled with Washington, and he wasn't going to allow any form of disharmony between our greatest ally. So how we develop these relations with the United States really matters. That said, there was this idea that Britain's Middle East policy was almost devised in Washington. There was a 4-year period under the Trump administration where this wasn't the case. And in fairness to the government, many people thought that it might roll over and just kowtow to this very different American president, but frequently it did not. In fact, frequently British foreign policy during the years of 2017 to 21 was actually diametrically opposed, or certainly not side by side with the Trump administration. I can give you a few examples on that. Of course, Trump himself wanted to withdraw from Afghanistan, wanted to withdraw from Iraq and Syria. In each of those cases, the British government was opposed. Trump decided that he was going to move the US embassy to Jerusalem. The British government also opposed, and they also opposed the American weakening during the administration of their policy towards illegal Israeli settlements. Largely, it is fair to say that Britain stuck with what was the pre-existing international consensus on most of these issues and didn't always side with Donald Trump. So it actually showed, I think, what some people surprised, a degree of independence from the Trump administration on these issues. And remember, there were other broader issues, climate change, for example, trade, where there are also significant differences. Back with the Biden administration right now, there's definitely a sense that the UK government is trying, by and large, to be closer, but there are also some key differences that we are seeing. We have not been, for example, as critical of Saudi Arabia as the Biden administration. So there are some sometimes subtle, sometimes quite overt differences there. But we also have to go to look at the European Union. Until Brexit, until 2016, of course, the lion's share of our foreign policy positions were defined as a common European Union foreign policy position. Now, in some ways, there are people within the current British government who want to actually demonstrate that we now have a foreign policy that is truly independent from Brussels, from the EU, and we can do things differently. And of course, they like to make great claims that on occasions we are able to move faster, that we are more agile, and so forth. And indeed, you know, on certain occasions, for example, imposing sanctions, we can now be. We can actually decide to impose sanctions. We don't have to wait for all the other countries to do so. You can make that argument. But of course, we are no longer sitting in Brussels, part of the decision-making process of the European Union. And, you know, this imposes upon us, you know, other questions that we will have to make these independent choices. We see in the British government right now, of course, a government that's more inclined to be closer to Washington and more inclined to be, if not close to Trump, certainly a traditional Republican administration would perhaps be, you know, more the ideal. So all of this matters, you know, in terms of before you even get down to think of all of these other issues in the Middle East. But you could also add certain other issues like security issues, the issues in terms of how to confront ISIS, issues principally post-Brexit, of course, about trade. So there is an accusation, and Labour makes it, you can decide whether that's fair, that our foreign policy now is more transactional, that we are actually attempting to have trade deals around the world. We have to negotiate those. You can have arguments as to whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, but it often means with certain countries that the primacy, that desire to sign a trade deal may well be the prevailing driver in the relationship. So at some point we are now looking, for example, to have a free trade agreement with Israel, also with the GCC, the Gulf Cooperation Council. And this is very important in terms of the government being able to claim that it has moved forward post-Brexit. As you know, there's now a minister for, you know, Brexit opportunities. You know, the government is obviously clearly very keen to demonstrate that it was all worth it. And these trade agreements are part and parcel of that. So that's really, you know, extremely important, you know, in terms of the backdrop. And then, you know, you add on the events of the last few years, where so much of the oxygen of the foreign policy making machine has been sucked up by other issues, principally Brexit. I mean, I remember really from 2016 onwards, going into Parliament, the whole series of votes and debates, you'll all recall, it was almost painful to have to go through all of this. And I am a Remainer. I voted in favor of staying in the European Union, but it was very difficult to get debates on other issues. It sucked up all the political energy. It meant, for example, frequently that the travel internationally for politicians was much more restricted because there always seemed to be another vote to come back to, another leadership challenge to come back to. That restricted also British ministerial visits. Then, of course, you had the other thing, restricted travel, the pandemic. We're not out of that pandemic. Of course, the restrictions have been lifted in Britain, but let's not remember that when we're dealing with the Middle East, that those restrictions are often still in place, that they have much lower rates of vaccination. They may not be able to afford it. They may not be able to have the access to the vaccines in the same way that we are fortunate to here in Britain, in Europe. That also has meant that the region has felt somewhat ignored. And then now, if you look at the Foreign Office website today, there is pretty much nothing else but one issue, of course, and that is Ukraine. And, you know, this has also now dominated proceedings. And it's for very understandable reasons. Of course, you know, the whole crisis with Russia has upended all the security architecture of post-war Europe. It poses significant issues. But I think sometimes what is not appreciated, sometimes in Westminster and London, is firstly the impact that it will have on other areas of the world, fuel prices, wheat prices, and secondly, how this war is perceived. And I think these will hopefully shine a light on some of these crises. So firstly, the war in Ukraine is really hitting the Middle East and other areas because of the high wheat prices. Egypt, for example, imports more wheat than any other country. Much of that comes from Ukraine and Russia. But countries like Libya, I think Libya is 30%, it comes from there. Syria, which is a country that right now is, perhaps when talking to Syrians, in a worse situation than it has been at any point in the last 10 to 11 years. You're looking at a country where 90% of the population is in poverty, and there is a drought. And therefore, the inability to get wheat from Ukraine, the higher petrol prices, the higher prices of inputs, is not only affecting Syrians directly, but the ability of aid agencies like the World Food Programme to provide. And then you can say the same for a country like Yemen, that is suffering also huge levels of near famine conditions. The other way in which I would argue that the Middle East affected it is that simply, and I've sort of referenced this before, that all of these crises, all of which should have significant government focus, are being increasingly ignored. I could apply the same to the Palestinian conflict, to Libya, as well as Syria and Yemen. There is simply no sense that the British government has the capability and arguably even the desire to put much effort into it. If you look at the Foreign Secretary's Twitter feed, for example, over the last 4 or 5 months, there is barely a reference to crises that are going on in the Middle East. And it's a complacency here that somehow what goes on there to our south, to our southeast of Europe, will not impact us. Now that is really, truly for the birds in several ways. We are going to see increased refugee flows. We saw, of course, last summer that happening with Afghanistan. The situation in Syria is ripe for further waves of refugees into Europe that is increasingly hostile towards refugees. And unfortunately, Britain is probably at the top of that list. But also extremism, that you see ISIS is far from finished, complacency over that as well, and increasing numbers of attacks in Syria, for example, in April. And this follows the breakout of a prison in January in Haskeh in northeast Syria. It's extremely dangerous. So the organization has regrouped after the anti-Daesh coalition's military assault on Syria and Iraq, and is planning for the long term, and is still feeding off the same sort of levels of resentment and the feeling of some marginalization that many people in the region suffer from. So it seems to me also, as part of this, we just do not see the ability to walk and chew gum at the same time, deal with more than one crisis at one time. And this is, I think, very short-sighted. Not only that, the way in which this is seen is that Ukraine somehow is a local, regional crisis. And I think that is mistaken. It is actually really a global crisis. It has a global impact. And we should be engaging other countries to establish exactly what our strategy is towards Ukraine, how we are going to help other countries cope with the impact of that war, which could get worse, who knows, and to make sure that they understand our position, because you can be sure that Russia will be doing its utmost to persuade other countries to side with its position. I said the other way that Ukraine is perceived, and this is something I cannot emphasize enough. This war outside of Europe, outside of the developed world, is seen in very different light. It's seen as a war in Europe, carried out and conducted on very different terms. So yes, Russia has committed an aggression on a peaceful neighbor. It's committed war crimes. It has done carried out untold destruction to Ukraine. There's no question about that. And if you're a Syrian, you think of what Russian planes were doing to your cities like Aleppo, the city where my wife comes from, Homs, where they were pummeled and put into rubble, to Mosul, to Raqqa. Palestinians will think of Gaza, where their cities were also reduced to rubble. But they see the stark double standards. Whereas in the case of the Russian aggression on Ukraine, the British response is to go to the International Criminal Court to actually donate £1 million worth of funds to this, to say that it has a legitimate role in investigating crimes in Ukraine. In the case of, for example, Palestine, it doesn't even support the ICC in having jurisdiction in the case of Palestine, let alone supporting investigation into crimes perpetrated there by either Israeli or Palestinian actors. We see also an extraordinary level of boycott, divestment, and sanctions in terms of Russia. Most major Western companies have pulled out of Russia. Those that haven't have actually come into significant criticism by politicians and the media. We are seeing sports organizations, for example, boycotting Russia. We're seeing, and I think this is wrong, Wimbledon not allowing Russian and Belarusian players to participate this year. We're seeing people who don't want to play Tchaikovsky or read Tolstoy. And of course, we are seeing sanctions being imposed, strengthened week on week, people calling even for oil and gas sanctions. That is all being lauded. When it comes in certain other countries in the developing world, you see very little attempts for accountability, and Palestinians see that, in particular. Most of what they are seeing in terms of what is being carried out towards Russia, they have been asking in terms of their occupation, the oppression that they suffer from, and it's not happening. The double standards to them is acute. The double standards for Syrians also appears acute. Why was it then when Russia was participating in flattening Syrian cities that it wasn't kicked out of all these sporting organizations? Where was the call for Russia to be held accountable, the ICC, at that stage? So these are all things that they see. They also see the double standards in terms of American and European behavior over the years as well. Of course, they're looking at 2003 in Iraq, none of which, an obvious statement here, should detract in any way from the criticism of Russian actions in Ukraine. I think my argument would be that we should be trying, in the words of our own government at the moment, to level up, that actually we should be trying to apply the same sorts of standards that we have set in terms of Russia-Ukraine to other conflicts around the world. And one can talk here also of Yemen, the double standards where we are continuing to supply arms to one party to the conflict that has been accused of conducting war crimes, even as we are the pen holder at the UN Security Council. That is not being, I think, a responsible actor where you are trying to resolve the conflict. And I'm just going to finish on this thing. We should, and one of the lessons of Ukraine is if you let the whole conflict fester for so long, and we saw this 2014 to now, this conflict didn't begin in February. It began a long time ago, and we did nothing. We allowed it to fester. Well, we're doing that in the Middle East. The Palestinian conflict, of course, has gone on for arguably over 100 years. The Syrian conflict is now 11 years. Libya, Yemen, at least since 2015, arguably more. And we also have this long-running issue with Iran. Our failure to resolve any of these issues means that at some point, further crisis, further huge levels of refugees is very likely. So I'm going to finish now and just take some of your questions, but I hope that made a little bit of a sense as an entree into the subject.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Chris. It's much appreciated. And as you can probably see in the chat, we've got a few questions. So we'll start off with Anthony, and he mentions about the Department of Brexit Opportunities. You mentioned how the UK foreign policy is becoming more transactional. I remember at the beginning of the invasion in Ukraine, Boris Johnson, the PM, was very quick to go to Saudi Arabia to sort of, everyone was talking about new energy deals within the fossil fuels. Do you know what opportunities, Brexit opportunities, Anthony mentions, have been identified in the Middle East?
Well, I'm not sure that these opportunities have necessarily been identified by Jacob Rees-Mogg, who I think has been spending quite a lot of time going around and checking that people are working in the office. You know, the opportunities that are there, I suppose, are the ones in terms of the free trade deals that I've mentioned. I'm not sure that there are particularly any others that have been identified. I absolutely confess I have not checked out, you know, Jacob's, you know, ministerial Twitter feed as to whether he's dealt with the Middle East. He hasn't got a history particularly of doing much on the Middle East. So, I mean, I think that's where you're going to, you know, see this in terms of these free trade deals. I don't see anything else. So was there another part of your questions, Chris, there that Anthony?
I suppose in going into more detail, perhaps on the, not too sure if we've lost you there, Chris. I think, oh yeah, you're just back now. So in terms of, I suppose now, particularly with COP, there's a lot of focus on green energy, and obviously a lot of countries in the Middle East rely a lot on oil and gas exports. So I suppose, could you go into a bit more detail on what the UK relationship might be going forward?
Well, in theory, it should, on this issue, climate change was in the strategic review was identified as the #1 foreign policy priority. And of course, you know, we had COP26. The next COP is going to be in Egypt. And actually, in terms of the region itself, I would say that it certainly is playing catch up in terms of the environment and climate change. But that is now really going on. There is a realization at a popular level, at least, that climate change is actually going to impact the Middle East very heavily. We have actually seen in protests in 2018 and 19, for example, in both Iraq and Lebanon, where climate change and the environment had become real big domestic issues. You've had major water quality issues in Basra, the Iraqi city, where thousands, tens of thousands of people were hospitalized as a result of poor quality water. You're seeing in Iraq today huge dust storms very regularly, as you know, the water is dried up, deforestation, etc. Less river flow in the Tigris and Euphrates. So dust storms have become a big issue. But also in the Gulf, the realization that extreme heat is a threat really to the viability of these countries. So there is now a much greater debate, even amongst the oil-rich powers. And there was a much bigger showing of these countries going to COP. That said, amongst those oil exporting states, including, for example, Saudi, they are putting a lot into things like carbon capture. In other words, they're hoping still that the solution is carbon, but you can find ways to make the damage, you know, make it less environmentally damaging. There are some countries that are looking at things like hydrogen, and there are some countries that are working hard on issues like solar. I personally felt that the region should have been investing in solar decades ago, because of course it is one resource that countries like Egypt and Jordan, as well as in the Arabian Peninsula, have plenty of. But I can't really say that I feel that the British government has some major strategy on this specific to the Middle East. And it'll be interesting to see now that, COP has finished, as to whether there is still going to be this focus on climate change, whether there is any sense that there is a legacy here that Britain wants to have in all of this, or was it, all about trying to make Glasgow a success, and so forth. That's, I think, remains to be seen. But I cannot emphasize, I think that we're going to see this in terms of the debate in the Middle East. It's going to come up and up the agenda. Water quality, water availability, scarcity, desertification, these are all issues. Rising sea levels in the Nile Delta, for example, massive.
Brilliant. And that gives a nice little segue onto what Mark asked in terms of the issue of drought and the politics of water. I know that there's been some concern that a lot of I suppose the Chinese have been buying up a lot of water recently as well and causing some issues there. Mark asked if you could go into a bit more detail, in particular with the water issue with Israel, Palestine, and those issues on the Gaza as well.
Well, of course, the Middle East is, as you know, by and large, a region that suffers from water scarcity, particularly now, and there are areas of tension on this. Though, it can be argued also that actually the issue of water is so important and it's so vital to life that often it has actually led to increased dialogue and engagement between countries, not less. For example, there is actually, part of the Israeli-Jordanian peace treaty, a transfer of water from Israel to Jordan every year. The Israelis help out Jordan, one of the most scarce, water-scarce countries in the world. So, there are issues, other ones, of course, we said in terms of the Nile water, tensions between Egypt and Ethiopia, and those are very serious as well as with the Tigris and Euphrates, the reduction largely as a result of Turkish damming of the two rivers into Syria and Iraq. So all of these do create problems. I'm not sure we're necessarily going to get into direct wars on these issues. I wouldn't rule it out. But it certainly can escalate tensions, and it can be a driver, of course, for refugee flows. In terms of Israel-Palestine that Mark asked about, yeah, this is a massive issue. It's particularly politicized. In the Oslo Accords of '93, Israel determined, and the Palestinians agreed, probably because they had little choice, that water was a security issue. It would be a final status issue to be dealt with when everything else is sorted out alongside refugees, Jerusalem and borders. And this is how Israel deals with it. So Israel is in charge of the water resources. It doesn't, under those accords, the Palestinians have a limited number of wells that they can drill and so forth, but basically Israel maintains the control of the aquifers. And of course, the primary source of water that comes from up in the north off the Golan Heights through the Sea of Galilee. And you see now, of course, that the River Jordan is nothing more really than a saline trickle. So this is very, very difficult. One of the reasons that Israel rejects any border or a Palestinian state that is next to, adjacent to the Jordan River is that it doesn't want a future Palestinian state to claim its legitimate share of that water resource. You then have the issue of the Israeli settlements. The numbers of Israeli settlers now amount to over 650,000. They have privileged access in the occupied territories. So you will see typically Israeli settlements largely on top of hills with leafy, very green neighborhoods, and Palestinian villages, typically in the valleys, that have far, far less access to water. You see it also in the Jordan Valley, traveled up and down it many, many times. Very lucrative settlement plantations with palm trees and the like. Palestinian farmers and herdsmen can barely get enough water for their sheep and goats. So it is a massive issue and deeply political. In the Gaza Strip, the water quality is so bad that the WHO says it's not even fit for animals. Massively high salinity, presence of other toxins, fluorides, and so forth, and has consequent health impact as well on 2 million Palestinians. Now, that is also due to a variety of political issues, the contamination, for example, the inability to build new sewage works every single day. Tens of thousands of tons of raw untreated sewage enters into the Mediterranean. Of course, where does it go? The tidal actually washes it up towards Israeli ports, amazingly enough. But, you know, Gaza, you know, needs to have desalination plants. It needs to have treatment plants. It needs to have the sort of power that allows them to clean it up. That's not allowed as a result of the blockade, which is about to mark its 15th year next month.
Brilliant. Thank you, Chris. And that rolls on quite nicely to Michael's question, which is obviously we're talking about the comparison between the US and UK foreign policy within the Middle East. He says, could you say that the British haven't quite been as aligned to Israel as the US have been in the past, and perhaps go into a little bit more detail on that one?
Yeah, for sure. I would argue that since, I mean, people think sometimes that the US has had this very, very close relationship to the state of Israel from its birth in 1948. Actually, that sort of sense in the United States political system that Israel was its sort of leading ally, that it was going to depend on in the Middle East, really dates to 1967. There were presidents before that who have tended to be more critical. One thinks of Eisenhower and Kennedy at certain points. Remember that it was Eisenhower who compelled British, French, and Israeli forces to pull back in 1956 over Suez. It was Kennedy who also tried to exert the brakes on the Israeli nuclear program, amongst other things. But 1967 was a pivotal moment because when Israel basically destroyed, smashed the Egyptian and Syrian principally armed forces, as well as the Jordanian, in a matter of a couple of days, it demonstrated to the American administration that Israel could be an extremely productive American partner in the Middle East, of course, during the Cold War. I think it's debatable to the extent to which Israel has been a blessing or a burden for the successive US administrations. And of course, there have been some administrations that have been a little bit more critical than others, but largely it has been a bipartisan issue in Washington to support Israel. There are some changes. I think you are seeing American Jewish community in the United States having a much more debate about this as to whether they should give this unalloyed support to Israel. I think that debate is there. We see this debate also within the Democrat Party. Where you don't see it is largely with the Republicans, who, you know, still view Israel in a sort of Israel can do no wrong approach. I think that bipartisan period is perhaps ended. Trump was, for the most part, extremely favorable to Israel, even having a settlement named after him on the Golan Heights. You know, it's Pompeo as well, and he had his ambassador to Israel, David Freeman, etc., all very pro-settler. And the Trump plan wasn't worth, you know, the paper it was typed on. It really, and notably, I should point out here that although there was a little bit of lip service in terms of support, if you really look at the British statements, the European statements, there was nobody who got behind the Trump plan that Jared Kushner, you know, drew up. You can see in the Biden administration an unwillingness really to engage in this issue. And that perhaps replicated Obama's approach as well, in that it is viewed now as almost too tough to handle, that there's no point in, you know, putting in any great presidential input into this. I think Obama let John Kerry as Secretary of State had his head of steam, but didn't himself get too much involved. And I think there's that element of pivot away to Asia and moving away from the Middle East that also Trump had as well. So this government under Boris Johnson, I would say, though, is about as pro-Israeli as we've had for a very long time. And there isn't really a great deal of difference, to be honest. On some occasions, the Biden administration has been more outspoken than our own government. And I think there is a Brexit reason for this in part, and that you find the more Eurosceptic parts of the Conservative Party tend to soak up American politics and what they get from that. They don't look towards the European Union at all for inspiration. And the European Union had been the actor in international affairs that had stuck to that international consensus of a two-state solution, of occupation, of the application of the Fourth Geneva Convention, etc., and all of this. And the United States had not. So I think we're now seeing a situation where this current British government is extremely reluctant to criticize Israel at all, no matter what it does.
Brilliant, thank you. And that goes on to Lisa's point in terms of the double standards that you spoke about within Britain's response to Russian aggression in Ukraine versus its response in the Middle East. Obviously, we had that pretty disastrous withdrawal from Afghanistan, which I imagine definitely harmed sort of the outlook towards the West and its reliability on the international stage. Perhaps you could go into a bit more detail on that.
Yeah, sure. It's a very good point, Lisa. I could have raised a number of other issues in there as well, but I'll mention one, and that is the issue of refugees, where in Europe, the doors have been opened, free rail travel across Europe for Ukrainians, and people talking about blonde, blue-eyed Ukrainians. They're like us. Even to have a member of the House of Lords, Lord Hannan, write in an op-ed in the Daily Telegraph that they are like us because they watch Netflix and use Instagram, which is offensive at so many levels, but also ignorant, because if you go to the Middle East, I mean, they're passionate about Instagram, amongst other things. Not that I necessarily think that using Instagram is a mark of being civilized or not. It's a peculiar yardstick to use, perhaps, but that is also really noticed across the region of Syrian refugees, of Afghan, of Iraqis who have struggled to get into Europe. Then Europe opens its doors to Ukrainians. Yes, you can in part explain it to say the geographic proximity that Ukraine has, is directly neighboring, but that simply is not enough. I don't buy that as a sufficient argument. And some of the comments of leaders who had been so hostile to refugees from other countries simply does not tally. But fear not, the British government is not guilty of double standards on this whatsoever. We've maintained a very strict standard on this, not being welcoming as a government to refugees wherever. And it's so disheartening. I was in France recently, and I met many families who'd taken in Ukrainians. Willingly, proud to have done so. Those Ukrainians were treated with great respect and largely kindness. I think they reported a very positive attitude. And yet here, although we've committed to open our borders to Ukrainians, the bureaucracy, the administrative obstacles that are there, which shouldn't be there, have meant that so far we've hardly taken any in at all. And it is this real hostility to people who are fleeing persecution and conflict, which makes me wonder, who would open their doors to Britons if we were ever fleeing persecution and conflict. And I think that this deliberate mixing of, the difference between economic migrants coming here for, jobs and so forth, which, by the way, shouldn't necessarily be criminalized as something as awful, versus those who are genuine asylum seekers. It's extraordinary. But that's just one example. The differing reactions on so many things. I mean, even if you go back to 2014, the European Union, including Britain, passed sanctions against Russia after its annexation, occupation of Crimea within a couple of days. Well, Palestinians have been waiting for some form of sanction, even minimal sanctions about the Israeli occupation of their land for 55 years. So go figure. I hope that's answered in part that.
No, brilliant. Thank you, Chris. And I suppose just in the interest of time, we've got 9 minutes or so left. So I'll run on to Enaz's question. And they ask about if you could speak a bit more about Britain's approach to the Turkish government and its big-scale offensive against the Kurds, as well as northern Iraq attacking Shingal, where obviously they've had an extremely tough time with the dramatic 2014 ISIS genocide.
Yeah, it's a big subject. I think that, you know, Britain has close relations with Turkey. Both Theresa May and Boris Johnson have for some time put a lot of effort into that, even at a time when you are seeing President Erdogan behaving in a more authoritarian fashion, both domestically within Turkey, particularly after the coup in Syria against the Kurds and so forth. I think it's you know, very worrying. You know, there's certain things that, you know, one can commend Turkey for here. I mean, it's taken in, you know, I think the figure is something around about 3.8 million Syrian refugees, which is extraordinary. But it has also used those refugees at times for political purposes, and we saw this in the way that it opens the taps into Europe. And then the European Union sort of starts paying large sums of money to Turkey to make sure it doesn't. You know, it's basically trying to bribe its way out of actually its European Union's own responsibilities for refugees. But I mean, people don't talk about the Turkish occupation of areas of Syria. That's frankly what is going on. And we are seeing also increasingly signs of Turkey forcibly repatriating Syrian refugees into areas of northern Syria, typically areas from which they did not come, typically also Syrian Arabs into areas that were predominantly Kurdish. So this is an attempt to re-engineer the demography of these areas to a liking for Turkey, hoping to create some sort of Syrian Arab buffer presence between the Turkish border and large areas of Kurdish population. I find that, you know, this is very dangerous. It has, these sorts of policies are actually sown the seeds for future conflict between such groups. And I'm afraid that, you know, Turkey is part of that. I can't necessarily say that Turkey is the only one that is engaged in this. We also have issues whereby, for example, in Raqqa, which is predominantly a Syrian Arab city, that it is now under the control of the Syrian Democratic Forces, which is largely a Kurdish grouping, and there is some resentment building up there. Now, in all of this, we need to get the situation, hopefully, it's very difficult to put the genie back into the bottle, why identity politics is not so important, but all sorts of actors, including the Syrian regime, including others, have encouraged this sort of sectarian approach. They did it in Iraq, and it is very, very dangerous. There used to be times when predominantly Iraqis saw themselves just as that, as Iraqis. And now it's been atomized into sub-identities of whether you're Iraqi Sunni, whether you're Iraqi Sunni and also religious or not. Are you Iraqi Kurdish and what sort? And the same within Syria. It's very dangerous when you have so many identity groups, and you only have to look at a country like Lebanon to see the sort of things that can happen there if you do that. So I would like to think that Turkey could play a very responsible role in all of this. But it's not always doing so. That said, it is good to see some rapprochement between Turkey and UAE and Turkey and Saudi Arabia, because in the Middle East, it's these sorts of animosities that have driven some of these conflicts, made them worse. And if you can at least get some of these parties around the table and talking to each other, that's something the British government should be truly encouraging, including, for example, say Saudi talking to Iran, which is going on, the UAE, for example, opening up then, to talking to Iran and so forth, then that is to be welcomed.
Brilliant, thank you. And one final question for today, hopefully ending on a slightly more positive note. Obviously, we had the prisoner exchange with Iran not too recently ago. Would you say that this is an opportune moment to perhaps re-warm some relations with Iran?
Well, I would like to think so. I mean, Iran is a major player in the region. We've obviously had very poor relations with Iran ever since 1979. And even before that, we were engaged with the Shah's regime, even despite its appalling human rights record. So our policy towards Iran has been pretty checkered. Iranian behavior, of course, is not something to be admired. And, it is exacerbating conflicts across the region, as are others. I very much welcomed, I know Richard Ratcliffe. I happened to have met him back in the 90s. It was wonderful to see the release of his wife, Nazanin. It was noticeable that there was a lot of focus on Nazanin and not Anousheh, who was also released on the same day. And there are, of course, other, dual nationals still being held by the Iranians, frankly, as hostages. I think really we need to see progress on that, but above all, hopefully, some progress on the nuclear talks with Iran. It's looking in a very delicate situation at the moment. The ball, in some ways, is in the American court. The Iranians are demanding that the Iranian Republican Guard is delisted as a terrorist group. It's looking very that the Americans will do that. It then brings into a really sharp question as to what will happen if there is no deal. And even if there is a deal, how do you deal with an Iranian regime that has shown itself more than willing to use proxies across the region to create instability and so forth, whether it's Hezbollah in Lebanon, militias in Hezbollah in Syria, Yemen, and so forth, and also, support for Hamas, in Palestine. So one also hopes that Iran will try to find a different way to approaching the region, playing its role, that there won't be Doyle in that process, but it won't be, done through illegitimate and destabilizing means.
Brilliant. Thank you, Chris. And I think that draws us nicely to a close. And thank you, everyone, for joining us. It's much appreciated. I hope everyone's found this as fascinated as I have. It's been a real interest over the past hour. Anthony, I pass the floor.
I just wanted to say thank you very much, because this was extremely interesting and amazingly informative. So I just wanted to thank you very much. I found it extremely interesting. I'm sure all the 30 people plus who are listening found it also, and perhaps later the YouTube video will have lots and lots of hits. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. It was a pleasure to talk to you today and have this discussion.